I'm going to talk about data radar maps, and essentially it's a way to look at your organizational data framework. But before I actually start, let's do something different, right? Because this is one of my pet peeves about talks, which is I've been doing this for a while, and it's always a monologue where I say something and you guys listen, and then we ask questions. So how about instead we can do this, where at any point, if you don't understand, just like raise your hand and say, hey, I didn't get that, and then we'll try to figure it out. And so in order to do that, what's really important to say is, who am I and what am I going to talk about? So, I've been trying to think about how to present this, and a lot of people have this, the goal of like why I'm doing what I'm doing. And I think, honestly, if I were to think about why I'm really here, and these were only the couple of pictures I found, it's food. I think my life's goal is to really be as close to food as possible at all points of time, and I'm really proud about that. But I think other than that, what I've been doing for about like the last 10 years now is working with companies like these brands. As you see, I've been a data scientist, a data analyst, data engineer, and the idea really is to help product teams grow and also build a product with the help of data science, right? So that's why I've now started this company called The Joy of Data. Forgive the name, my name is Joy, the company is called The Joy of Data. And yeah, so today what I want to talk about is all the lessons that I learned from these companies, and then how we can maybe get some education and build some tools that we can then help these product teams grow. So let's do this. I talked about a little bit about myself. Let's talk about you guys a little. So usually when I present, there's a mix of product and sales teams, but just by show of hands, like, is everybody based in tech here? Is everybody in the engineering side? Okay, wow. So that's new, because usually there's a bit of product and tech. But let's talk about this. Like, how often do you guys work with data, and how often do you guys have certain kind of pain points when it comes to working with, I don't know, Excel sheets, any kind of data? So just raise your hand if you at any point in your work were like, there's definitely a better way to do this, and I can't believe people haven't done it. Do you face that? Oh wow, 2 hands. Oof. Okay, so let's talk about that. I mean, given the fact that all of us in tech do interact with data, let's really ask ourselves, how do we interact with data? And there's a number of ways to do this, but if you really think about the manner of how we interact with data, there's really 2 ways. There's a reactive way and a proactive way. And I kind of put this meme up there because it is important to really for you to like grasp that there's one bad side and a good side. And I'll give you some examples of what reactive and proactive processes are. So reactive processes are whenever you need the data, you just import it then. You don't really have a taxonomy or a definition. You just, final v2 presentation.csv. Your dashboards or any kind of insights need to be manually updated. So you get data from like the next user survey, and someone needs to go in and then pipe that data in, bring that insight, right? Doesn't sound great, but there is another side. And the other side is, yeah, you have regular data things, you have defined taxonomy, your database schemas are defined. So someone new joins the company, they know exactly what to expect, what to work with. And your dashboards also update, as the data is being available. So this is really great. Now, what's interesting is if you were to look at this particular slide, you can find that there's actually some patterns. Like there's data imports here. The data are not syncing. There's this big thing called taxonomy here. So there's aspects that you can see we need to talk about in order to really talk about how we go from one aspect to another, right? Because if we're seeing patterns where there's, data imports, taxonomy, there's this concept of processes and dashboards that come up quite a lot. The question you really want to ask yourself is, okay, if that's, where I am and that's where I want to go, and going back to this meme of Drake, the idea is, how do we really go from sad Drake to like happy Drake, right? Because that's what's important is, we want to move towards organizations which are more sort of future data driven, or at least proactive in the way they work with data. And a really simple answer is just checklists. You just have a bunch of stuff that you do to make sure that you're not missing out on these things. But to be honest, again, this is what the checklist will be about: your dashboards, organization, etc. And I mean, if I'm being honest, checklists are boring. they're not the most fun way to sort of talk about what you do with your data. And so one of the ways we did this was we said, hey, what if we take this, you just move it around like this, and then, right in here, there's a big gap. So why don't we do something here that's a bit more visual in terms of how we're approaching these like checklists? And so that's really where this sort of radar map comes in, where you have all these checklists, you have all these segments, and you have a particular scale, which really tells you whether you're doing better or worse. And if you just refined it a little bit, if it loads up, there you go. If you just refine it, like let's just make it nicer. So you have organization, taxonomy, tools and processes, fluency, utilization. Now, I'm going to go through all of these, but I found this meme which was actually perfect, which is, well, actually, let me tell you a little bit more, and then I'll get to the meme. So yeah, it's an actionable artifact. This is the most important thing, right? You want to use it for something, not just a pretty thing that you put up on your company or like office walls. You'll notice that this sequence right here is a Fibonacci sequence. And the reason for that is, as you know, that the more evolved your data framework is, the more difficult it gets to get higher up there, right? And so it's not a linear scale. You can't just be a little bit better every time, but the more evolved you are, the more difficult it gets to actually then mature. 5 key segments that I'll talk about, and yes, it's used periodically to track product growth. So you have a product and you have data, and you're really trying to understand, how do I make use of this particular artifact to understand where I am in terms of my data framework. And so at this point, when I usually present, people's faces are more genuinely like this, that, yeah, I have a question, like, that doesn't make any sense, and why, and how, and so I think to do this, a better way to explain and give you the idea of where this came up from was one of the clients that I work with, and actually these guys are friends now, but there's a company called JustMad. You can look them up. It's a product and design consultancy, essentially. That's Raz and Anna over there. And the idea, or essentially the value that they provide, is they work with these product teams to then sort of build roadmaps based on metrics and values and data that they care about, right? So essentially, think of them providing the tools and documents and metrics necessary to the product teams to then understand what do they need to care about, right? And what's really important is they need data. So for the work I did with JustMat was they would design the product side of these artifacts, and I would design sort of the data side. And so remembering this, if we take an example and we start going through this data radar map, let's start at the very top. So we would start with organization, right? And so what exactly is organization? It's a segment where we care about the efficiency of your organization, if your architectures that are already built. And the way we score this is, there's data governance policies, architectures, security and privacy measures, exactly how I'll show you in the next slide. But the most important thing is we workshop here with the data teams that are actually building these infrastructures, the kind of tools and platforms they're using, what kind of best practices do they have in the organization, if they even have any. And so let's start with an example. So we do, for this section, I think, there's 10 questions for this particular segment. There's a score we do from 0 to 5, as you can look at the other side. And inside each segment, there's different aspects, right? There's architecture, governance, security, and privacy. I'm not going to go through it all. But if you look at that number 20, and as you see, the max score is 50, the first response is, wow, we're not doing so well. And this is something I really want to stress on is, as a consulting agency, we don't care about the best and the coolest data framework. What we care about is what you care about. So we ask every client essentially what's important to you and what is relevant to you. So this is where we put this teeny little slice called, okay, but among those, tell us what's high or low in terms of relevance. Because maybe you don't really care about access and authorization protocols because you have a teeny startup about like 5 people and you don't need to implement that. So even if you're not there, it's not important, right? And so here you see what happens is the ones that you care about is high. 15 out of 25 is a little bit better than what we showed you before, right? And where I come in, is essentially find a way to take that number 15 and distill it into one of these scores. And this is important because this is essentially all these questions are directed at a particular aspect of your framework. And what we're trying to do is give you an assessment of where you lie today among the things that you care about. Questions? Thoughts? Okay. And then one more thing that's very important here is when we do this, we obviously know where you're doing better and where you're doing worse. And that's very important to show. So one thing we also do show you is, look, you're doing really well on those aspects, but for example, there are no pipelines that you've developed at all, right? And this is really actionable because this is something where the data team realizes, okay, it's not like technical debt, but it's also something that they've completely ignored because, well, maybe that didn't fall on the roadmap or was not prioritized, right? So these are sort of the artifacts we talk about in the organization part, where we give you the score, we give you exactly where you're doing well, where you're lacking, and we'll give you these graphs as well, so you can do this every quarter or every time period, so you know how you're progressing, basically. So let's do a few more. So organization, let's talk about taxonomy. Again, it's very similar, but different sort of direction, which is how are you defining your data? What kind of relationships do you have? What kind of responsibility do you have? Which means who's really taking care of the data? Who do you really go to when you need a particular, I don't know, data import, etc. Similar things here. I'll actually take the phone to me. 6 questions, max score of 30. As you can see, the aspects are different now. There's grouping, relationship, responsibility. Data stakeholders is important. Who exactly needs and uses the data and why that's actually relevant. Then let's talk about tools and processes. As you can imagine, this is more about what kind of tools you're using. I think that slide's actually outdated. Yeah. Anyway, this is more about what kind of tools you're using, what is the exact infrastructure for storage and access, etc. Let's go into, actually, yeah, there's an example of tools and processes here. So ETL, basically, which is something I think a lot of people will know. But essentially, if you look at each of these aspects inside ETL, what you're really asking about is when you, let's say, when you output the result, are you compatible to certain BI, certain databases, certain storages? And as you can see here for the client, it's actually quite relevant because that's sort of the prototyping phase that they're working with. And that's why they're at a 4, even though if you look at loading into target systems, they're actually quite low in that aspect. Cool. Let's do a couple more. So data fluency is very important. You want the people who are using and building the data to actually know what they're working with and what that is about. So what we really score them here on is how do you really understand the metrics and KPIs that these stakeholders or the people that actually are working with the data? Do you understand statistical and analytical methods? Because, I mean, I can keep saying mean, median, etc., but do you understand why we're using those metrics? Are there any pain points there? Then there's data utilization. So this is more about how on a scale of 1 to 5, for instance, how much are people actually engaging or using with your data? This is what we're trying to understand, like what are the meeting rituals with your data teams? How often are product and tech teams actually interacting in terms of this data? And so here, if you look at the metrics we care about here, there's engagement, data-driven decision ratio, and time to insight. So if I were to give you an example of what these are, data engagement index is simply a lever which says how engaged are the people that you're giving and providing the data to on a scale of unhappy to happy. And so this is a metric where you can say, we're creating a lot of dashboards, we're creating a lot of insights, but people don't really understand it or people are not engaging with it. So maybe that's something we need to work on to then actually provide the value that they could be using from it. Data-driven decision ratio, I think that's pretty straightforward. 4 decisions that you need to take. One of them is data-driven. Not the greatest. You want to actually bump up that number so that more of the decisions you take are becoming data-driven. And time to insight is essentially from the beginning, from the moment you actually get data that you can build insights on to the point where you see actionable insights. What is that time? And that's probably something that you want to be as low as possible. So, given all of that technical jargon, let's talk about why do teams need it. And so here's an example of, let's say we ran one particular analysis. We got this at the end of, let's take 2023 Q1, right? So you ran this and you said, okay, that's what it looks like. And of course, we go into details, but you can see there's so many aspects that you're lacking behind. A lot of people in your, or a lot of team members know what to do with data, but you really haven't had a lot of progress in the tools and processes, no definitions. Maybe you could do better in the organization. And so what's key here is we take all these insights, we provide this to the client, and then the client will obviously do something, put different items or projects on the roadmap, such that in Q2, they evolve and do something like that, right? And this is where the actionable part comes in, is that it was based on the previous status of the radar map where they understand, okay, this is where we need to go. And if you really look at it closely, you'll see the data fluency actually goes down. So it's not always a progressing graph, because sometimes maybe you have, so if you look at the left one, there were, ooh, maybe I do this. So if you look at the left one here, there were no tools and processes, or like it was underdeveloped. And now here you have a bunch of different tools and processes, which means people are now using different tools, different processes. And that obviously means that a lot of team members maybe don't know how to use these tools, so your fluency went down. And this is one way of making sure that at any point you know where you need to work on your data framework and what exactly it's representing at that state of time. Right, and last one. Yeah, this is something I get a lot. So a lot of the questions are, okay, what exactly is data-driven and how can I use this to be data-driven? So I'm going to give you an example. This is not the most, I mean, it doesn't have to be the only thing you use, but an example is, let's say you want to do feature planning. You want to know what features you want to use. You have a small startup. You don't have unlimited resources. You just want to make sure which features should you prioritize, right? And how do you do this based on a data-driven model? So there's this thing called the Kana model. Maybe you guys are familiar with it. But the idea is, if you look at the y-axis, it goes from a dissatisfied to satisfied. So from a customer point of view, the feature you build, this is how satisfied the customer will be with that feature. Completely angry to very happy and satisfied. On the x-axis is how fulfilled is that feature. So in the middle is like MVP, nothing, to all the way to, wow, it's a beautiful product and completely finished and done. I'll run you through an example. So let's take, for the y-axis, if that loads. Yeah, right, there you go. So let's take customer surveys. You want to understand how satisfied these customers are with this feature. You run simple customer surveys. But here, if you look at the right, you really don't need all those fancy bells and whistles. What you need are just tools and processes to collect that data and then just utilize that data. Really, just get surveys, get information from those surveys. That's fine. But now let's look at the x-axis. So the x-axis is feature dev. So now you go to your feature teams or your tech teams and say, okay, I need to build this feature and this is the roadmap, blah, blah, blah. And these are all the aspects you need to worry about. You need to worry about organization, taxonomy, tools and processes, because you want to develop a feature which is properly defined, properly organized, and of course are using the right tools, right? So with this knowledge, let's go into, let's say, a real life example, because I think it gets a bit more clear where you really understand how people use it today, if it will change. All right, yeah. So this is actually a very nice image I found. It's from Mexico, but it's the same graph I showed you before, just with some additions. And the way it works is, if you start with the blue one, so the blue one is basic needs. And it's better to do a proper example. So it's like a ride-sharing app, right? So forget about Uber. Let's just say we wanted to build an app that allows people to drive, like hail cabs or taxis or ride shares. Your basic need is the availability of different car types, because you could have 2 people, 3 people, 4 people. You could have multiple people, and you want to have choices, right? So that's your basic need. You can't just offer a ride-sharing app where there's seats of 4, right? It's very limited. And so that's where you start with. But then, I mean, cabs had this, right? You could hail a cab, you could hail a bigger cab, you could get in a bus. Why did we use Uber? The reason we use that is because they gave you this performance need, which is now the pickup time will be in minutes, like 2 to 3 minutes. And this is where they're breaking into this niche category, or breaking into this, okay, now I choose Uber or like the ride-sharing app over your basic need. This is why it's a performance need, right? And then, of course, there's delighters. So delighters is you sometimes step in the car, well, and there's Wi-Fi. And you're like, oh, that's great. I mean, I don't need it, but the fact that it's there, it's amazing, right? So that's a feature that would be very nice to have, but it's not really critical. And then if you look at this gray region in the middle, this is something we call essentially features that people don't care about. So if the Uber app is black, blue, red, you don't care. It doesn't really matter to you. So, you could go for, you could build a feature where it just changes the entire UX, or especially in the color scheme, but I don't think your users are really going to care about it. So that's something we say, well, it's great, but we're not going to spend a lot of time on it. And now, if you were to sort of look at the priority of these features, it's kind of very intuitive to say, okay, I think I'm going to go this way. Let's do an arrow here. So I'm going to go this way, or I'm going to start with basic needs, build on it by performance, then go maybe to delighters, and at the end, if I have time and resources, I'll go to basic needs. So that's essentially it. I mean, that's what we do is we collect this data. We then sort of calibrate what these basic needs are and which features belong where, because then it's really easy to just orient them and say, okay, now these features go from a low to high priority, and your highest priority right now is just build the basic different cab settings. And then move backwards where you reduce the pickup time, maybe add Wi-Fi, and at some point, make the app a bit more colorful and nice and pretty. So that's an example of how you can, like, product teams and, let's say, business development teams can work with the data teams to then understand how we have to take decisions on features, but how do we use the data we have and the data we collected to then drive this particular priority or roadmap. I think that's pretty much it. Let's see, what do we have? Okay, let's do a quick summary. I think we learned a bit more than that. What we learned is, number one, start being proactive. So we always have this. I had this beautiful quote I heard the other day that's there's by this psychologist who talked about big data. He said, big data is like teenage sex. Everybody else thinks everybody else is doing it. Everybody else thinks they're doing it. Everybody claims that they're doing it. Nobody knows who's doing it. But then when asked, everybody's like, yeah, we're doing it the best way. And nobody has any clue. So it's something that we need to talk about is when we think about data, let's be a bit more proactive about why and what exactly the needs are of data, instead of just being, okay, I need this insight, so let's just build a dashboard. We can measure each aspect of this organizational data framework with the tools I talked about. And of course, the most important thing is, sure, build data-driven workflows, but build something that teams can understand, because a cool data-driven workflow that teams don't understand is still ineffective and not helping the actual team members. And that's it. I think if you want to get in touch, I think I had a slide here. Yeah, exactly. That's me, and yeah. Questions, and yeah, please, if you want to reach out.
Any questions, anybody?
Oh, cool, thanks.
So, is there any kind of data that you think it wouldn't fit this radar model?
Yeah, it's a lot of qualitative surveys actually are very difficult, because if you look at the slide back here, let me see if I can go back. So here, so customer surveys, these we usually do, for example, semantic scales from a scale of 0 to 5, say how satisfied are you with the ride featuring app. And the problem is, a lot of the times nuance is important in these features. So you want to know why exactly someone rated it 3, even though the median says, or the mean is 4. And so here, the way we usually work with is we try to distill that qualitative feedback into some form of metric. But again, that's very nuanced, and that's very difficult to say, I'm just going to take, even if you do NLP and you analyze the sentiment, it's just an abstraction of what you can really put into that. So I think, yeah, that's definitely something I think about, but I really don't know actually how to put that into like a quantitative metric, if that makes sense.
I was going to ask also, how do you know the validity of the measuring that you are doing with with all these checklists?
That's a good point. So one of the things we do is we always we give this tool to the particular client to run it every, let's say, 3 months or quarter. And the way we do this is we genuinely ask them in terms of let's take, what's the best example? So let's take fluency, for example. We would say, we give you a score of X, and you know what that means, but then you run, you run that survey 3 months from now, and you get a different score Y. What we really want to understand is, in, let's say, internal conversations or internal meetings, is that actually helping? Because a lot of the times we build this and people say, okay, what do I do for you? And we say, just use it as a baseline to have other processes and discussions, not just say, well, now my fluency is 5 and I'm doing well, but like go back and say, we had these workshops or we had these sort of tutorials. is that helping you do your job, or is that really actually impeding you because now you have more to learn, but not actually knowing what you're trying to do? If that makes sense.